Welcome back to the course on English varieties. Today I would like to talk about standard language. Now you know that variation within languages or dialect variation may be of different types: regional, social, ethnic, gender, or stylistic. Patterns of variation exist at different levels of a language, including words and their meaning, that is, lexical variation, pronunciation, phonological variation, sentence structures, which is morphosyntactic or grammar variation, and even conventions for language use, pragmatic or discourse variation. Last time you've learned that languages vary not only across speakers but within speakers. Therefore, a language is a complex and very diverse phenomenon. Nevertheless, many people equate the term language with the standard language, which is in fact just a version of the language held to be correct in pedagogical grammar books and usage guides, and it is used in education, workplace, and the government. Because the standard is associated with education and sophistication, other varieties of the language are often considered to be lesser versions of the language, perhaps not as fully formed or maybe sloppy in comparison with the standard. However, to the linguist, language isn't just its standard version, but rather the sum of all the varieties that comprise it, the continuum of all its forms. Besides, sociolinguistics, the study of language in its social context, has demonstrated that all varieties of the language are equally complex, regularly patterned, and capable of serving as vehicles for the expression of any message their speakers might wish to communicate. Hence, the term dialect for a linguist carries no negative connotation, but is simply a neutral label to refer to any variety of language, including the standard variety. Most European languages underwent the process of standardization more or less at the same time. This attempt to impose one version of a language as a standard was largely caused by the same forces: the desire to refine and to fix the national language.
Traditionally, linguists distinguish two ways in which the process of standardization may develop. The first one involves the process of creating a new form of the language based on several already existing varieties in a specific territory. It happens when there are several distinctive dialects whose local power is enormous, and there is a necessity to create such a form of the language which would be mutually intelligible for all the speakers, but would be localized and identified with no territory of the country. This way of standardization is common for Germanic languages, such as German and Norwegian. The story of creation of Standard Norwegian is rather peculiar. Norway was under Danish control for more than 400 years and got its independence in 1814. However, 400 years under the rule of Denmark influenced the Norwegian language greatly. Danish and Norwegian languages are rather similar, and those who lived in the cities and towns in Norway tended to speak more like the citizens of Denmark, while the rural population tended to preserve more features of the quote-unquote traditional Norwegian. So when Norway got its independence, there were no unified form of Norwegian. Linguists in the country did not share a common opinion on the process of standardization. They suggested two ways to construct a new form. Some of them suggested that the new standard Norwegian language should be based on the speech of people who live in the cities. Others argued that rural dialects are pure and preserve the true Norwegian mentality. As a result, Norway now has two standard varieties. One is based on the speech of people living in the cities and is called a bokmål. The other is based on rural dialect and is called a nynorsk. The difference in the percentage of people who speak these varieties is rather sharp. There are somewhat 86–90% of people who speak a bookmål and only 10–12% of those who speak New Norsk. The other way to form a standard language is implemented when there is one dominant variety, usually a regional dialect of the capital, which is considered to be more prestigious than all other dialects. In other words, one regional variety gains so much power that it becomes the norm for the whole country. Standard English is an example of such development. Let's regard the process of standardization for British English.
In my first lecture, I've already mentioned the periods of the history of English. Briefly, scholars traditionally determine three of them: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Towards the end of the first period, one of the four major dialects of Old English, the West Saxon dialect, attained something of the position of a literary standard. Most texts of that period were written in that dialect. However, this development was arrested by the Norman Conquest, which greatly changed the history of the English language. English started to regain its former position on the British Isles only in the 13th century. However, a new attempt to impose a standard took place much later, at the end of the Middle English period.
Middle English is characterized by a striking diversity of its variants. Literally, the language differed almost from county to county. Out of this variety of local dialects, there emerged towards the end of the 14th century a written language that in the course of the 15th century won general recognition and has since become the recognized standard in both speech and writing. The part of England that contributed most to the formation of this standard was the East Midland district, and it was the East Midland type of English that became its basis, particularly the dialect of the metropolis, London. According to Albert Bow and Thomas Gable, this result was caused by several factors. In the first place, as a Midland dialect, the English of this region occupied a middle position between the extreme divergences of the north and south. It was less conservative than the southern dialect, less radical than the northern. In its sounds and inflections, it represents a kind of compromise, sharing some of the characteristics of both its neighbors. In the second place, the East Midland district was the largest and most populous of the major dialect areas. The land was more valuable than the hilly country to the north and west, and in agricultural age this advantage was reflected in both the number and the prosperity of the inhabitants. By far the most influential factor in the rise of Standard English, according to the scholars, was the importance of London as the capital of England. Indeed, it is altogether likely that the language of the city would have become the prevailing dialect without the help of any of the other factors previously discussed. In doing so, it would have been following the course of other national language, French as the dialect of Paris, Spanish as that of Castile. London was, and still is, the political and commercial center of England. It was the seat of the court, of the highest judicial tribunals, the focus of the social and intellectual activities of the country. Bow and Cable even state, and I quote, "The history of Standard English is almost a history of London English."
It is generally believed that the purest example of the London English of that time can be seen in the works by Chaucer. However, it would be a mistake to think that when Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales at the end of the 14th century, Standard English was fully established. Indeed, it was just the beginning of a long process that lasted several centuries and resulted in the formation of a literary standard, codified and fixed for the whole nation. Thus, towards the end of the 15th century, the London Standard had been accepted, at least in writing, in most parts of the country. Considerable diversity still existed in the spoken dialects, but in literary works after 1450 it becomes almost impossible to determine the region in which a given work was written.
Some regularity in the language was brought by printing. First publishing houses apparently were founded in London, copying the speech of the capital. Despite that, many variations in spelling had remained in the 16th century, even for personal names. For example, there are 6 known examples of Shakespeare's name that he wrote himself, and in each one he spelled his name differently. It's no surprise that in the 16th century first demands to fix the language appeared. For example, in 1582, Richard Mulcaster, an English educator, had written, "It were a thing very praiseworthy, in my opinion, and no less profitable than praiseworthy, if someone well learned and as laborious a man would gather all the words which we use in our English tongue, whether natural or incorporate, out of all professions as well learned as not, into one dictionary, and besides the right writing, which is indecent to the alphabet, would open unto us therein both their natural force and their proper use." Here I preserve the spelling of the author for you to witness the differences between early modern English and contemporary English. These differences resulted in the process of standardization that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries. The beginning of this process of fixing the language can be attributed to the publication of first dictionaries. The earliest dictionaries were those explaining the words in Latin or some other foreign language, and the earliest English dictionaries were dictionaries of hard words. The first of these was a little book of 120 pages by Robert Corddry called A Table Alphabetical of Hard Words. It was published in 1604 and explained some 3,000 terms. This dictionary was very popular, and more similar dictionaries followed. In the 18th century, dictionary writers began explaining more ordinary words, not just difficult ones. In 1746, a group of booksellers asked a young writer called Samuel Johnson to prepare an English dictionary. Johnson worked on the dictionary for 9 years with the help of 6 other people. For 3 years, he read the works of hundreds of English writers and found examples for the words he planned to include in his dictionary. Then he began to write the meanings of these words. When Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language appeared in 1755, it was an immediate success. It explained more than 42,000 words, and as well as the meaning of each word, it provided examples from literature of how it was used. Even though Johnson's dictionary was viewed as preeminent, it was not perfect. Some of Johnson's explanations were harder than the words themselves. Some expressed his personal opinions, and some words were not listed because he disliked them. So the work on English dictionaries continued, and not only because of dissatisfaction of the published dictionaries, but because the language continued to develop. It is clearly seen when one considers the making of the Oxford English Dictionary in the 19th and 20th centuries. The work on the dictionary commenced in 1879 with the appointing of James Murray the editor. The plan was to finish the job in 10 years. Murray organized a very large reading program. Hundreds of people sent him examples of how words were used. After 5 years, the first part of the dictionary was completed, but it only went from A to Ant. Everyone realized that the job was going to take a lot longer than 10 years. In fact, it took another 44. Sadly, Murray did not live to see its completion. He died in 1915, aged 78, while he was working on the letter U. The first Oxford English Dictionary was completed in 1928 and explained the meaning and history of 414,800 words and expressions. The Oxford English Dictionary was edited and republished a couple of times, increasing its size. In 1989, it contained 615,100 words. In 2000, it went online, and every 3 months, new material is added.
I hope it's clear that the process of standardization and codification is conducted by a certain group of people who are usually scholars, authors of textbooks, and language teachers. Their main purpose is to conserve the language in a specific, well-established form. The spelling and the meaning of words, as well as their use, was first codified for the English language with the help of dictionaries. Grammar standardization followed the codification of English vocabulary and was carried out with the publication of grammar books.
There had been a few grammar books in the 16th and 17th centuries. The first being pamphlet for grammar by William Balacar. He published it in 1586. His textbook was modeled after a Latin grammar book. However, in the second half of the 18th century, a very large number of grammar books suddenly appeared. Nevertheless, the tradition to describe English grammar as that of Latin lasted for more than 2 centuries, when many aspects of the English language were explained through the notions of the classic language. For example, in a grammar book published by Thomas Dilworth, it is stated that the English noun has 6 cases. You can see the example of how the word a book should be declined according to these cases on the slides. Thomas Dilworth's New Guide to the English Tongue was first published in 1740, and it was used by such profound and eminent figures as Noah Webster and Abraham Lincoln. In this textbook, the cases of the English noun are illustrated with the help of the concept of declension, which is clearly a feature of synthetic languages, such as Latin. However, you can notice that these cases are not marked with the help of inflections, as they are in synthetic languages. Instead, these forms are purely artificial constructions created by the author of the grammar book to confine to the rules of Latin grammar. Occasionally, writers recognized that the plan of Latin grammar was not well suited to exhibiting the structure of English, but Latin influence lasted far longer than one might have expected. For example, the grammarians of the 18th century believed that an English sentence should not end with a preposition, because this did not happen in Latin. So it would be correct to say, I like the town in which I live, but not, I like the town which I live in. The authors of the first grammar books formed a prescriptive approach to the English language that had an everlasting impact on its development. Their grammar books told their readers how to write and speak correctly, which really meant how to use language in the same way as in serious pieces of literature. They were written for the rich and aimed to show the difference between the upper and lower classes. They were widely used because people wanted to show that they were educated. As a result, many native English speakers thought that the way they spoke and wrote was incorrect and were ashamed of it. The authors of these first grammar books exerted self-imposed authority and acted as judges in public disputes about competing language forms. For example, they settled the use of pronouns after conjunctions than and as. You can see 2 possible examples on the slides. Here you have 2 conflicting forms of the pronouns in the absolute and objective cases. According to the prescriptive grammarians, the choice of pronouns is determined by the construction to be supplied or understood. Thus, it is correct to say, he is older than she, but he likes you better than me.
There are many other cases where prescriptivists determined which form should be used in standard English. Thus, They immensely contributed to the process of fixing the language and, in general, its unification for the processes of education and public official use. Even though the grounds on which decisions were reached were often faulty and the decisions themselves were often arbitrary, I tend to agree with Bo and Cable that a considerable number of disputed points, rightly or wrongly, were settled and have since become established. Thus, with the codification of usage and the settlement of many matters that were in dispute, much of the uncertainty that troubled the British was removed. Here I find it necessary to quote Ilya Yegorovich Gruzinov, who was a professor of Moscow University in the 19th century. Apart from being a very talented doctor, he also spoke English, and in 1812 he published one of the first textbooks for learners of English in Russia. In the foreword of the textbook, he writes, "In the second half of the 18th century, many educated English started vehemently to refine their tongue. They studied the similarities between the words, investigated the basis for the rules of this language. Briefly, they eliminated the chaos and built a system of the language so that the difficulty of its learning disappeared." It is remarkable that the work of English grammarians of the 18th century was appreciated not only in Britain but abroad, because not only native speakers of English but foreigners as well urgently needed the English language to be standardized.
While acknowledging the results of the 18th century grammarians, I believe it is necessary to emphasize that they did not take into account the importance of usage as the main judge in linguistic methods. Changes that happen in a language quite often appear to be capricious and very often are not visible to the speakers themselves. That is why it is virtually impossible to legislate some constructions out of use just because they violate the logic of a certain group of scholars. Let's illustrate it with the help of the following example. Here is a typical prescriptive rule that dictates the way how to form negative questions with the first person subject pronoun. On the slide you see a sentence in Russian, and the actual translation of this sentence can be as follows. Aren't I good enough? However, according to the prescriptive rule, the form aren't I is incorrect, since the form of the verb to be for the pronoun I is not are, but am. Hence, the correct version of this sentence should be as follows. Am I not good enough? According to this rule, the tag to the sentence I am good enough should be am I not? Nevertheless, I doubt that many native speakers would use this particular tag. They would still say, I'm good enough, aren't I? Because the form am I not is considered to be pedantic and pretentious by many native English speakers. That is why many contemporary grammar textbooks, especially those for learners of English as a foreign language, include the rule that states that the form aren't I is more preferable than am I not in such questions. That is why at the end of the 18th century one witnesses the beginning of the modern approach to grammar description, a descriptive approach. It is based on the fact that the only correct way to explain the rules of a language is to follow the usage. In other words, descriptive grammarians closely monitor the use of a language by the majority of speakers and formulate rules based on such observations. If the majority of speakers form the tag questions with the form aren't I instead of am I not, they codify this usage in the grammar book. That is why descriptive rules are the same for all the speakers and tend to be more democratic and less elitist.
So the process of standardization for British English was long and complex. You've learned that the London dialect started to be used as a written standard for the whole nation in the 15th century. Its spelling started to be codified with the help of the first dictionaries in the 17th century, and the mass publication of grammar books in the 18th century formulated the rules of sentence structure. What about pronunciation? Was there ever a standard way to pronounce words so that the educated were differentiated from the plebeian?
There were some attempts in the second half of the 18th century to decide on one correct pronunciation, but the process of standardization of English pronunciation took place in the 19th century. It was connected with the newly emerged accent known as received pronunciation. RP is a young accent in linguistic terms. It was not around, for example, when Dr. Johnson wrote a dictionary of the English language in 1755. He chose not to include pronunciation suggestions as he felt there was little agreement even within educated society regarding recommended forms. The phrase received pronunciation was coined in 1869 by the linguist Alexander John Ellis, but it only became widely used to describe the accent of the social elite after the phonetician Daniel Jones adopted it for the second edition of the English Pronouncing Dictionary, published in 1924. The definition of received conveys its original meaning of accepted or approved, as in received wisdom. We can trace the origins of RP back to the public schools and universities of 19th century Britain. Indeed, Daniel Jones initially used the term public school pronunciation to describe this emerging, socially exclusive accent. Over the course of that century, members of the ruling and privileged classes increasingly attended boarding schools such as Winchester, Eton, Harrow, and Rugby, and graduated from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Their speech patterns, based loosely on the local accent of the South East Midlands, roughly London, Oxford, and Cambridge, soon became to be associated with the establishment and therefore gained a unique status, particularly within the middle class in London. The spread of RP among the upper classes of Britain in the 19th century is interestingly explained by Geoff Lindsay in his book English After RP. Lindsay connects the popularity of RP with the building of the British Empire. Again, you will see that the matters of power and language are interconnected. Lindsay argues that a small country like Britain could only control a planetary empire through a strict hierarchy of power and authority. The crown and the London court naturally sat at the top, and colonial subjects were at the bottom. Stratification and rank were vital, and this included ways of speaking. In addition, Britain's industrial powerhouse, fed by materials from the colonies, was generating a new class of people with wealth. It was important for the ambitious and aspirational to acquire the manners of those at the top, and therefore to conceal regional and social markers. Schooling was a key element in the maintenance of both the empire and RP. The empire required a large proportion of Britain's ruling class to live abroad. They left their sons in boarding schools, known as public schools, where they were conditioned to behave with the manners of those in authority, and in terms of speech, this meant RP. Of course, the great majority of Britons never spoke RP, and in an age before radio, many of them hardly even heard it. But everything changed when Lord Reith, the first general manager of the BBC, adopted RP in 1922 as a broadcasting standard. Since that time, RP received its greatest popularity and even started to be called BBC English. Reith believed standard English spoken with an RP accent would be the most widely understood variety of English, both in the UK and overseas. He was also conscious that choosing a regional accent might run a risk of alienating some listeners. To a certain extent, Rees' decision was understandable, and his attitude only reflected the social climate at that time. But since RP was the preserve of the aristocracy and expensive public schools, it represented only a very small social minority. This policy prevailed at the BBC for a considerable time and probably contributed to the sometimes negative perception of regional varieties of English.
It should be noted that RP is an accent, not a dialect, since all RP speakers utilize standard English. In other words, they avoid non-standard grammatical constructions and localized vocabulary characteristic of regional dialects. RP is also regionally non-specific. That is, it does not contain any clues about a speaker's geographic background, but it does reveal a great deal about their social and educational background. That is why RP is a social accent.
RP is probably the most widely studied and most frequently described variety of spoken English in the world. Yet recent estimates suggest that 2% of the UK population speak it. It has a negligible presence in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and is arguably losing its prestige status in Wales. It should probably therefore be described as an English rather than a British accent. As well as being a living accent, RP is also a theoretical linguistic concept. It is the accent on which phonemic transcription in dictionaries are based, and it is widely used in competition with General American for teaching English as a foreign language. As I've mentioned before, from the phonological point of view, RP is a neutral accent, as it does not contain features which are traditionally associated with particular territories of the UK. When they characterize dialects and accents, linguists use a number of phonetic features. For example, the degree of rhoticity, which is low in RP, and such phonetic phenomena as H dropping, TH replacement, glottal stops, and J dropping, neither of which is present in RP. Like any other accent, RP has also changed over the course of time. The voices we associate with early BBC broadcasts, for instance, now sound extremely old-fashioned to most. Just as RP is constantly evolving, so our attitudes towards the accent are changing. Received pronunciation was mainly the brainchild of the Victorian era for much of the 20th century, and for much of the 20th century it represented the voice of education, authority, social status, and economic power. However, Victorian notions of social hierarchy faded as the new century progressed. Women won the right to vote, and men, returning from 2 world wars, demanded greater economic equality, while colonial peoples were deemed worthy of self-government. The pace of social change accelerated rapidly in the 1960s. Pop culture brought new glamour to Britons from the lower classes, like the Beatles. The once accepted superiority of the upper classes was undermined by political scandals. Social privilege was no longer seen as prestigious, but rather as unfair. And for the first time, the speech patterns of those at the top began to be perceived negatively. As a result, fewer younger speakers with regional accents consider it necessary to adapt their speech to the speech of the elite. Indeed, many commentators even suggest that younger RP speakers often go to great length to disguise their accent by incorporating regional features into their speech.
In contemporary Britain, diversity is celebrated. Prominent figures in business, politics, academia, and the media exhibit a range of accents, but London and the South are still dominant in wealth, power, and influence. Accents of the South, particularly middle and upper middle class accents, are heard more often than others in public life, and in the TV programs and films that are seen internationally. Thus, the accent of the English South is considered a new prestigious form of pronunciation. Probably in the future, it will replace RP as a pronunciation norm for those who learn English as a foreign language. Well, that brings me to the end of my lecture on Standard English, a very complex but very interesting phenomenon. You've learned that the process of standardization requires centuries to take place, but it hardly finishes, since the language always changes, as well as the attitudes of the society towards various language forms, words, grammatical constructions, and even accents. Besides, when we talk about Standard English, it also should be mentioned that there is more than one standard in the English-speaking world. Some of them have been formed in the past, like in the United States of America and Australia. Others are still at the beginning of this process.